Okay, welcome to my Explain Everything on the 2017 VCAA exam. As you can probably tell, my voice is sounding a little bit different. I'm pretty sick right now, but I'm going to make you this Explain Everything. So if you can't get in to give me the exam to mark, although you should, you can at least listen to me go through the answers. All right. So I'm not going to go through the multis. I'm just going to go through what the tips and tricks are for the 2017 VCAA exam. Okay, one thing I did not say before was that given that I'm working off a very old computer, I actually can't annotate this, unfortunately. So normally I would write in the answers and kind of show you where the, I don't know, key questions are, but I actually can't do it on this computer, so I'm just going to have to work with voice alone, so I do apologise for that. All right, so the first question is 3 marks. It is name each stage of Selle's general adaptation syndrome as it applies to each role of cortisol given in the table below. Okay, now we're looking at the name of each stage. We're not talking about substages. So if you were to write substages like shock and counter shock purely by themselves, that would be incorrect. So the answer was resistance for the first one, alarm, and alternatives could be alarm reaction, alarm counter shock, and for the last one, exhaustion. Now, the average for this question was 2. So a lot of people got at least one of these boxes wrong. A really common mistake was that people didn't actually read through the questions or the statements properly, and so they did alarm, resistance, and exhaustion, and that's why they lost marks. Okay, so question 2 is also out of 3 marks, and the average for this was 1.9. So this was about Nixon, who worked in a restaurant, and 2 masked intruders demanded that everyone hand over their wallets. So Nixon was interviewed by the police, and he was also interviewed by television reporters who asked questions like, how old were the boys who robbed you and what type of weapons did they have? So in the later court cases, the reliability of his testimony may have been questioned by the defence lawyers for the accused. So in terms of Loftus's research, why would defence lawyers question the reliability of the description that Nixon gave the police? So this is talking about Loftus's research into the reliability and the reconstruction of memory. Okay, question 3. So as you can see, this is out of 8 marks, but we know it's subdivided into a few different parts. Now, what I would expect is that VCAA is going to have a very similar structure to their exam this year, in so much as there might be not many questions, but they will be divided into subparts. The other thing to note, however, is that you might get bigger questions and they may not be subdivided into like smaller portions. So what you'll need to do, if you have that in a scenario, or if you get that, you need to subdivide it yourself and use subheadings to organize your response for yourself. So question 3. Watson arranged a classically conditioned 11-month-year-old little Albert to produce an emotional response to a white rat by pairing a loud noise with the presentation of a white rat. During conditioning, Albert's response to the white rat was to startle and breathe heavily. After conditioning, he trembled and cried in fear every time he saw a white rat. He also generalized this emotional response to other white furry objects, including a rabbit and a dog. Albert left the experiment while still demonstrating an emotional response to the white furry objects. So the first question is out of 4 marks. Identify and describe the role of the neurohormone and brain region that are primarily involved in the consolidation of little Albert's conditioned emotional responses. Okay, so we're talking about the emotional response. You got 1 mark for identifying a neurohormone and a brain region, and then the second 2 marks were for describing the role of those components in little Albert's research. Now, you could be relatively generic, however, it's always best to apply to the scenario. So the neurohormone that we were looking for was adrenaline, although you could have said noradrenaline. So adrenaline activates the fight-flight response, and that was for 1 mark. Now, you could also say that adrenaline causes the release of noradrenaline, which activates the amygdala. It's actually not correct to say that the amygdala that adrenaline activates the amygdala. We know that it's adrenaline, then that activates noradrenaline, and that is the thing that actually activates the amygdala. So the easiest one to talk through here is adrenaline in so much as it's the neurohormone that activates the fight, flight, freeze response in little Albert when he was scared. The brain region was the amygdala. Now, the amygdala has a role in consolidating and encoding emotionally arousing responses, okay? You were able to talk about the amygdala working with the hippocampus to consolidate the explicit part of the emotional memory. However, you cannot talk about the hippocampus by itself because the hippocampus only deals with the explicit component of the memory. It has nothing to do with emotions. So the best response for this part was the amygdala, in so much as it consolidates emotionally arousing responses of little Albert's fear of the white rat. Okay, we're still on question 3, but now we're looking at questions B and C. Okay, so question B. In terms of neuroplasticity, describe the role of long-term potentiation in the development of little Albert's conditioned emotional response to the white rat. So we're talking about the fear response. Now this is out of 2, and the average for the state was 1.1, so they actually did relatively well. On the other hand, question 3C, using the language of classical conditioning, suggests how Watson and Rayner could have extinguished little Albert's conditioned emotional response. The average for that was 0.7 out of 2. So let's look at what we could say for these things. So in the first one, we're talking about the role of neuroplasticity, okay, and more specifically long-term potentiation in the little Albert of his conditioned emotional response. So 1 mark, we're talking about that biological basis, okay. So for 1 mark, you had to demonstrate the knowledge of long-term potentiation as a neural mechanism that enables synaptic connections to be strengthened. Now, the only thing you really had to say was something along the lines of, that LTP is a form of neuroplasticity, or LTP causes a strengthening of the connections between the neurons, okay? Or just give me the definition of long-term potentiation. The second mark is a suggestion of what was associated. So ideally what I'm looking for is when LTP occurs, this strengthens the association between little Albert's fear response to the loud noise and the presence of the white rat, okay? So what we were looking for was this association of the fear response to the loud noise and the white rat through repeated pairings. In terms of classical conditioning, so question C, 3C I should say, we're looking at the language of classical conditioning. When you see something like this, and I would also recommend you do it in question B as well, you need to make sure you're using your elements. In this particular question, question 3C, if you did not use your elements, you got 0 marks. Now, what we were looking for was for 1 mark saying repeated presentation to the CS, i.e. the white rat, without the presentation of the UCS, i.e. the loud noise. Now, that is done, until the CR, fear of the white rat, no longer occurs. So 1 mark for saying the CS is presented without the UCS, and the second mark is saying until the CR no longer occurs in response to the CS, okay? Making sure, of course, you apply to the scenario. Now, what I will say about this is that all of you need to go home and learn those definitions for the processes of classical and operant conditioning. They are things that can be examined and they can really stump people. Make sure you know how to apply the elements to both classical conditioning processes, so things like extinction, spontaneous recovery, stimulus generalization, so on and so forth, as well as the same ones for operant conditioning. Okay, question 4, 11 marks, and again, this is a few sub-questions. So Serena was sitting in the garden playing when she felt something crawl onto her leg. She saw that it was a bee and brushed it away. Shortly after, she involuntarily kicked out her leg and felt a stinging sensation that made her scream loudly in pain. She realized that she had been stung by a bee. So question 8, identify the division of the nervous system and the type of response involved when Serena brushed the bee off her leg. That's 2 marks. The average for this was 1.1, okay? So a lot of people actually got 1 or both of these identify questions incorrect. The other thing to note for this particular question is spelling is really important. So if you didn't spell the word correctly or if it made another word, then you actually didn't get marks. So she's brushing the bee off her leg, okay? So that is she's initiated a voluntary motor movement, so the division is the somatic nervous system. Her response, of course, is conscious or it's voluntary. In terms of question B, in terms of the nervous system functioning, name and explain Serena's response when she kicked out her leg. So now, if you look up in the scenario under question 4, you can see that she involuntarily kicked out her leg and then she felt the stinging sensation. After that, she realized she had been stung by a bee. This is out of 3 marks. The average again was 1.8. So again, lots of people got this question wrong. This is a response about the spinal reflex or the reflex arc. So you got 1 mark for the naming the response, so spinal reflex. 1 mark for an explanation of the reflex arc in terms of sensory neurons, interneurons, and motor neurons. And then 1 mark for suggesting that the response is involuntary in so much as it occurs at a spinal level before it goes to the brain, okay? So you can integrate, excuse me for that, you can integrate both of those aspects into, or both those marks into kind of like one statement. Now, this is a response that I want you to make sure that you know down pat, okay? We are talking about the sensory receptors, okay? So Serena's sensory receptors in her leg receive the pain of the bee sting. Sensory neurons send so the sensory message of the pain is sent up to the interneurons via sensory neurons, and the interneurons in the spinal cord initiate a motor response or a motor response of her involuntary kicking out her leg that is sent down to her leg via motor neurons prior to her realizing or prior to the brain receiving the information that she has been stung, okay? So make sure you know that response down pat. I'm still seeing a lot of you saying something like the sensory message without talking about the sensory neurons or just talking about the message, okay? You need to make sure you're saying sensory message, sensory neurons, motor message, motor neurons, okay? And again, we've got 2 very basic questions. So following the bee sting, Serena showed her fear response anytime she saw a bee. One afternoon when she was playing in the garden, an insect landed on her leg. She immediately screamed loudly, brushed the insect away and kicked out her leg. She realized it was a beetle, not a bee. Identify the process of classical conditioning that best accounts why Serena reacted this way to a beetle landing on her leg. The state got 0.7, so relatively well done, and the answer for this was stimulus generalization. So question D, the state did much less better. Well, they didn't do as well, I should say. They got 0.4 out of 1. So she developed a phobia of bees and refused to go into the garden. Identify the process of operant condition that best accounts for why Serena's phobia has been perpetuated. That's pretty easy, guys. We know what perpetuates a phobia, and that is operant conditioning. More specifically, it's negative reinforcement, which is the correct answer. And VCAA did not accept anything else of these 2 questions. Okay, so the last one of question 4. So this is for E. Explain how systematic desensitization could be used to help Serena overcome her phobia. 4 marks. Excuse me. Now, the average for the state was 1.8, so the state is really bad at this question. That is why I want you all to go and make sure you know that 3-phase model structure of systematic desensitization that I've taught you. If you can use that in any kind of scenario involving systematic desensitization, you are going to get your marks, okay? Even if it doesn't explicitly say the 3-phase model, please make sure that you do it, okay? Because if you can do it, then that is actually going to give you all the elements that you need to get this question correct, okay? In the next Explain Everything I make, I'll show you how to structure it again, okay, just in case you've forgotten. But please, practice it, practice it, practice it, okay? So the state, as I said, they got 1.8. Now, what we were looking for this was actually quite loose, to be honest, and I would like your response to be much tighter. So we're looking for 1 mark, learning a relaxation technique, okay? So it had to be a relaxation technique, and of course you had to apply it to the scenario. The development of fear hierarchy for 2 marks, and you had to give some indication of what a fear hierarchy was. So, showing Serena a picture of a bee, then maybe taking her out to a garden, then maybe having a bee being placed on her skin. The third mark was the gradual exposure to increasingly fearful stimuli, so the picture, going to the garden, whatever, paired with practicing the relaxation technique. And then the fourth mark was continuing the process until the feared stimuli can be exposed without producing the fear response. So what I'd actually rather you say is continuing the exposure to the fear stimuli, i.e. whatever it is to do with a bee, until that particular stimuli produces a relaxation response to the bee rather than a fear response. So make sure you're using your elements with this as well, okay? Because if you have a really good response, it means it can be applied to lots of different questions, okay? And you don't have to vary your response too much. Okay, question 5. This was a bit of a difficult question. So this was a study about finding that caffeine prevents stress, and so it was about a group of rats, and they did certain things with caffeine and things like that, okay? And so you need to read through the article, and you needed to obviously analyse it in terms of a few different psychological theories and factors. If you get something like this in the exam, which you're going to, just PS, of course you will, like that's how the exam is going. What I would suggest you do is in reading time, make sure you read these articles or bigger bits of writing a fair few times. And that way it's really going to help you to cement like the key points of the article or whatever it is in your mind. So the first question is, A, caffeine is considered to be a stimulant. Identify the likely changes to the amplitude and frequency of the brainwave patterns expected in a person after they've consumed caffeine. So the changes, okay? Now, what this means is because we're talking about changes, it means you can't say high or low. You have to give an increase or a decrease, okay? So we were looking for something like decreased, lower, smaller, reduced amplitude, and increased, higher, faster, quicker, greater in frequency, okay? So it had to indicate that change rather than just saying small, high, or whatever, okay, which does not obviously indicate a change. The state did relatively well in that question with the average of 1.2. Now we have question B down here, and this caused a lot of controversy in the examiner's meeting because of the presence of this word antagonist, which is actually not strictly in the study design. However, if you were to read the article properly, and if you know what an agonist is, you know what an antagonist is, okay? It just does exactly the opposite. Now, I think this really freaks people out because the average for this was 1.1. The question is, with reference to the lock and key process, explain how caffeine could act as an antagonist for adenosine in the brain. So we had one, excuse me, we had 1 mark for talking about what the lock and key process is. So a neurotransmitter, it has a chemically distinct shape, which is a key, and it will bind to a receptor site that has the complementary shape, which is the lock, okay? There was 1 mark for talking about how caffeine acts on the receptor site of adenosine, i.e. it inhibits the postsynaptic neuron from firing, excuse me. And then the 3rd mark is application to the scenario. So saying that because it prevents the postsynaptic neuron from firing, it inhibits the mood-lowering effect of adenosine, okay? So what we're saying is caffeine is a similar shape to adenosine, so it's a chemically distinct shape. Key, it fits into the receptor site of adenosine. It inhibits the postsynaptic neuron from firing, and so it stops adenosine from working, and so it stops it from inhibiting mood and tiredness. Okay, so question C. In terms of the scientific research methodologies and techniques outlined in this article, 1, name the type of experimental research design used and identify one advantage of this type of design. The average for this was 1.2. Now, it was actually pretty ambiguous as to what this research design was. So it obviously wasn't repeated measures because we had 2 distinct groups, but it was actually unclear if it was a matched participants design or an independent groups design. So consequently, VCAA allowed both responses. So you had to name one appropriate design and give one advantage, okay? So, for example, if you choose a matched participants design, a great advantage would be the ability to minimize extraneous participant differences or to avoid order effects or things like that, okay? Now, just a note, if you're talking about a matched participants design, a matched participants will minimize rather than eliminate a participant difference, okay? Also, when you're talking about your advantages and disadvantages, it's always better to talk about why it's an advantage or a disadvantage rather than just give me like the fact that it is an advantage. So if you're talking about the fact that a matched participants design will minimize extraneous participant differences, why is that? Okay, why does that happen? Okay, so just make sure you kind of add a little bit more just so the examiner really knows what you're talking about. So question CII outlined the caution that Dr. Kanha should provide regarding the generalizability of results from his research. So his research was on rats, and so what that means is you actually can't generalize research on rats to the population of humans. And the state did relatively well on that, so 0.7 got that response. Now, lastly, this was a difficult question. So explain how the comparisons between the 4 groups of mice in the study enabled Dr. Kanha to conclude that consuming caffeine prevents the effect of chronic stress on mood and memory. This was out of 5 marks. The state got on average 2.4 for this question. So to gain 4 marks for this question, students need to explain the comparisons required to build the line for causal reasoning that allow the conclusion to be drawn. So they could express their knowledge in a variety of ways, including terms of experimental design and hypothesis, and in terms of the results that were observed in the particular comparisons. So what the easiest way was to get responses or to get marks was to give 2 comparisons of the results, so 2 trends including the research, and from that draw 2 conclusions about the research. Okay, question 6. So this one is 9 marks. So Zach lives with his parents and contributes financially to the household by paying all of the rent. Zach was quite stressed about the expectations placed on him to provide financially for the family. Recently, his grandfather, who lives with him, became quite ill. Zach felt unable to cope with these stresses and tried to manage his distress through substance use. He subsequently lost his job and isolated himself from friends and family. Finally, his sister encouraged him to seek professional support from a psychologist who then diagnosed him with a mental health disorder. So for question A, identify 1 biological risk factor and 1 psychological risk factor that are present in the scenario and outline how each of these factors may have contributed to the development and or progression of Zach's mental health disorder. Okay, so what we can see here is we've got 4 marks, and so it's 1 for identifying an appropriate biological and psychological risk factor and 1 for outlining how it might have contributed to his illness. Now, the average for this question was 2.1, and that's because most people didn't have enough explanation when they outlined how the biological and the psychological factor could impact on his mental health. So biological, we would only accept substance abuse because that was the only biological thing found in the scenario, and psychological things like stress, poor self-efficacy, or impaired reasoning were acceptable. Okay, now, for the outlining of these factors, you couldn't just say substance abuse will precipitate or will perpetuate, for example, Zach's illness. You actually had to explain why, okay? So we're looking for something like substance use. So substance use could change the biochemistry or the neurochemistry in Zach's brain, and so therefore it could be a contributing factor to him developing the mental illness. Okay. In terms of stress, this could contribute to his development of the mental illness because he has poor coping strategies and the development of anxious thought patterns, okay? Just make sure that you're not saying like precipitates or perpetuates and things like that. So we're talking about, and you're not saying development and or progression, given that's in the question. So just make sure you're using different words. Question B was 1 mark, so we're looking for a different type of coping strategy. And the only thing you really need to say was he could use an approach strategy. And half of the states, nearly or mostly, got that correct. So for question C, one social strategy that Zach's psychologist could recommend to Zach to increase his resilience. So what we're looking for is, for 1 mark, a recommendation of a social strategy, and for another mark, how this would increase his resilience. Now, you couldn't just say, therefore it would increase his resilience. That does not get you 1 mark. You actually have to add to that. So Zach, for 1 mark, he could have joined a club or an interest group. He could attempt to re-establish connections with his friends and family. So all of those suggestions are 1 mark, okay? That is how he could use a social strategy. Now, how would that help him? It's a protective factor against social isolation. It could increase his sense of self-efficacy. It could increase his resilience through re-establishing connections. That last one isn't very good, but I think certainly increase like it being a protective factor or increasing his self-efficacy is a really good one. Lastly, question D, identify one possible source of stigma and how this stigma could be a barrier to Zach accessing treatment for his mental health disorder. So we just wanted one source of stigma. It could be from himself, it could be the community, it could be his family, it could be friends. And the way that it stops him from, and so therefore it stops him from seeking treatment because he's too embarrassed, okay? So good answers were things like he could feel ashamed about seeing a psychologist because people see this as a sign of weakness, and therefore that will stop him from continuing his sessions, okay? So we wanted like one party that would stigmatize him, so himself, community, others, friends, whatever, and then why, okay? So he feels embarrassed, he feels shame, so on and so forth. Okay, so this is question 7, 13 marks, very similar structure to what we've seen before. This is a practical investigation. Now, it's unlikely that you'll have to write one, but you certainly may have to analyse another one in this year's exam. You may even have to write like a certain section, like a discussion or something like that, okay? So that is just something to keep in the back of your mind. The first question is Jamie's identification of the dependent variable correct? Justify your response. So you got 1 mark for saying no, because it was incorrect, and 1 mark for giving the correct DV. And so something about the recall of the list of the 20 words, the percentage of 20 words to record correctly, or memory for list of 20 words was acceptable, okay? So that was question A. Question B, identify the sampling procedure that Jamie used and a potential limitation. So the sampling procedure was a convenience sample. Make sure you spell that correctly and do not say convenient sample, because that's not right. And a potential limitation is that not everyone in the population has an equal chance of being in the sample. This means that the sample is not representative of the wider population, and that's where you should apply, and therefore results cannot be generalized, okay? Now, when you are talking about sampling, just make sure you say all of it. Don't have an equal chance. By sample, or it's not representative of the population, you cannot generalize. For things like this, make sure that you're applying to the scenario. Even though in this particular exam it could be quite general, it's always best that you apply to the scenario, because you never know when VCAA's going to want you to be really, really specific, okay? So for best practice, please apply, okay? In terms of question 7C, the average was 1.4 out of 2. And so you had to identify an alternative sampling procedure that Jamie could use to improve the validity. So we're just looking for a random sample, and this is because everyone in the population, apply what is the population, has an equal opportunity to be in the sample, so therefore the sample is more likely representative and the results can be generalized. Okay, pretty easy. Okay, so question D. This really confused a lot of people. The question and the 3 questions, or the 2 questions after this, really weren't clear. And so we really had to accept a really wide variety of responses to this question. The question was actually wanting you to provide a serial position effect, okay? Although we found it very hard to interpret the research as a serial position effect curve. And so there are lots of variations in responses to this. And yeah, so this was a bit of a funny one. So this whole exam actually wasn't particularly great, but oh well, it is what it is. So you got 1 mark for labeling your axes appropriately, and so obviously you want to make sure that your x-axis and your y-axis are labeled appropriately. When you are giving your IVs, they can be simple. Your DVs should be operationalized, please. Now, for the 2nd mark, you just had to show a trend. So VCAA accepted a whole lot of different responses. They accepted a serial position effect curve. They accepted just a bar graph for the maintenance group. They accepted 2 bar graphs for the maintenance and the elaborative rehearsal group, okay? So as long as it kind of like had some bearing on the question and the evidence, it was fine, but the spirit of this question was actually for the serial position effect. So question E was out of 2, and the state got 0.7. This was really, or the responses were really based on how students had interpreted the graph, I suppose, or the results. And so because there was such a wide range of interpretations, we really had to accept a range of responses. Now, what I will say is that you're not going to get something similar this year, okay? This was a massive anomaly, and it happened because the person who wrote the exam obviously hadn't taught the content. Of course they hadn't, because they can't teach when they write the exam, and so they didn't understand the spirit of the context of the dot points. So it was problematic, but that's okay. You're not going to get something like this. So what this was really looking for was the serial position effect, okay? So you got 1 mark for outlining the primacy effect and 1 mark for outlining the recency effect, pretty much. So pretty much you're just saying that 1 mark was awarded for recall would be higher or near perfect for the first loads in the list for the primacy effect, and that's because there was enough time for the information or the words to be rehearsed and encoded into long-term memory. There would also be a high level of recall or retention for words at the end of the list due to the recency effect, because words at the end of the list were retained in short-term memory. That was the ideal response. Now, you didn't actually have to reference specifically the primacy and the recency effect. You didn't have to name the terms. You just had to describe the effects. For some students who talked about, I guess, the limited capacity, or interpreted the question in terms of how maintenance rehearsal has limited capacity, they could get 1 mark if they talked about how the capacity was exceeded in the last part of, or the tail end of list, or the end of the list. Sorry, very much struggling here with my terrible cold. So this question, it was a bit of a hard one, so I wouldn't stress too much about it, okay? However, if you only referenced 1 store, i.e. short-term memory, you only got 1 mark. So for question 7F, this was, in terms of the factors that influence people's ability to remember information, what explanation could Jamie provide to account for the elaborative rehearsal condition producing better recall than the maintenance rehearsal condition? So the state average for this was 1.2. Because it has a comparison in here, you need to make sure you are also giving a comparison. So pretty much, the way that you can break this down is you can talk about what elaborative rehearsal does, okay? So it allows new information to be linked meaningfully into existing information in long-term memory. Now, what that does is it organizes information in better, and it also provides retrieval cues, okay? Now, what you also had to do was you had to apply it to the scenario. So you're talking about Creating meaningful links between the items in the list, so the rhyming pairs, or between the studied items and the information stored in long-term memory, more specifically talking about the rhyming pairs. And then you want to make sure that you are talking about how that produces better recall than maintenance rehearsal. So pretty much what you're looking for is a definition saying that those rhyming words will provide more retrieval cues, and therefore recall is more effective or better in elaborative rehearsal than it is using maintenance rehearsal. And last question. So this was the extended response, and this is where we came up with that yucky question. I think it was in the mental health SAC where you all lost a mark. And that's because you had to write this in the tone of what the response wanted, okay? So this is talking about shift work, and it's asking about how shift work can affect people, given that it allows them or it makes them have partial sleep deprivation. So you need to create a detailed and a clearly organized set of notes that Tim would most likely have taken during this presentation to give to Alira. Okay. Now, in the things that you were talking about, you need to talk about things like potential changes to the regular sleep-wake cycle of night shift workers, potential consequences of a person's psychological functioning if they are experiencing partial sleep deprivation, as well as one protective factor and one intervention that employees could use to adjust to changes to the sleep-wake cycle. So this was a bit tricky because you have to really wade through the question to get all of the content that you need to discuss, okay? But once you've done that, realistically, this is a pretty easy question to talk about, because all you're doing is you're just thinking about everything you know about those components. Now, just remember, this is a holistically marked response. You cannot use dot points. You can, however, use subheadings. And I would encourage you all, for God's sakes, please use subheadings in your extended responses, because it helps a reader to find the information, okay? If you make it easier for the examiner, then it's going to be easier for the examiner to give you marks, okay? So let's run through the things that you could have talked about for this response. Now, just keep in mind the average for this was 4.7, okay? And realistically, we're giving you a 5 if you can basically address every point in this extended response. So if you can find and address everything in this extended response, you'll at least get a 5, okay? And I know you can write much better than a 5, so all of you, I'm hoping, will at least get like a 7. All right, so what are we talking about? So we're talking about the potential changes to the regular sleep-wake cycle of the night shift workers, okay? What you should always do is you should always give a definition first. So what is shift work, okay? So when you're talking about shift work, you should also be talking about the fact that it will change the circadian rhythm, okay? So what is the circadian rhythm? Define that. Talk about how shift work, there's a mismatch between the internal body clock and the external environment, okay? It also is a really good idea to bring in biological aspects of like melatonin and the suprachiasmatic nucleus, okay? So all of those things is going to make your response much better. When you're talking about potential consequences on a person's psychological functioning, then I want the ABC: effective functioning, behavioral functioning, and cognitive functioning. I don't want you to just list what happens. I want you to list, and I want you to describe how these sleep deprivation effects could actually affect Alira and Tim's functioning on the job. So make sure you always link it back to the scenario. One protective factor could have been anything that we use to maintain mental health, so social support, cognitive behavioral strategies, good diet, good sleeping patterns. I think probably the best one to use, or the easiest one to use, is like sleeping patterns, having a good diet. But make sure you're not just listing the information. Talk about how that's actually going to affect the sleep-wake cycle and how it's actually going to maintain health, okay? Always link it back to the scenario. And then, of course, there's an intervention. Ideally, you're going to use a bright light therapy, okay? Now, that's really the only one that makes sense. I really wouldn't recommend you talk about cognitive behavioral therapy, okay? It's not the best one, okay? Make sure you're defining bright light therapy. You're talking about what it does, so it will delay the secretion of melatonin. You talk about when it's exposed or when the person is exposed to it and how that will affect their sleep-wake cycle, okay? So what is it? What it does, so melatonin, or link back to melatonin, when they give it to them and how that will affect their sleep-wake cycle, okay? So when will they feel tired? What will be the effect of this on the job, okay? So this was relatively easy. It was just content. And if you get something like this on the exam, break down the question and use subheadings, okay? Make sure that you can talk about everything you can think about in terms of the question, okay? So you know with like circadian phase disorders or anything like that, you're talking about melatonin, okay? Always bring in as much as you can from crossover areas. I can't imagine that your extended response is going to be content again. I expect it's going to be a data analysis, okay? But again, you can still bring in your content points, and that is going to make your response richer. All right. Now, that's that for the 2017 exam. I hope that made some sense. I'm so sorry. I'm not feeling very well, and I don't have a very clear head right now. But if you have any questions, let me know. And please, if you haven't given me your 217 VCAA, I'd love to mark it for you. Okay, bye.